The night on the iron borderlands was so silent that Valen could hear the embers crackling in the clay stove. Then came a creak from the pantry. When his oil lantern cut through the dark kitchen, he found no common thief, but a starving orc clutching a turnip and a stale loaf of bread. The rain had been falling since sundown, tapping against the wooden shutters of Valen's cottage like impatient fingers. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling where a crack ran from east wall to west, an old wound the house had carried for years. He knew every inch of this place, every groan of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the gap beneath the back door. That was why the sound woke him. It was small, a single creak from the direction of the kitchen, the kind of sound a branch makes before it breaks. Valen was not a young man anymore. His knees ached when the cold settled in, and his right shoulder had never fully healed from the war on the northern marches 2 decades past. But his hands were still sure. He reached for the oil lantern on the bedside table without needing to look, lit it on the second strike of flint, and pulled on his heavy wolfskin coat. He did not take a weapon. That surprised even him later when he thought back on it. He had lived alone on the edge of the iron borderlands long enough to know that strangers at night meant danger. The town of Millbrook sat 3 miles east, where men like Captain Vagger kept order through fear and silver. Out here, past the point where the Tescan River roared loud enough to drown out a scream, there was no law but your own. Yet Valen walked to the kitchen door with nothing but a light. He had come home from the wars a different man than the one who left. He had seen what weapons did to people who hadn't deserved it. He had carried those images in his chest for years, heavy and cold. Building fences, tending his turnip garden, hauling timber on the Tescan barge. That was how he kept from sinking. The hallway was dark except for his lantern's orange circle. The smell of old wood smoke and damp earth filled his nose. He paused at the kitchen door, listening. Silence, then the soft sound of something being wrapped in cloth. He pushed the door open. The lantern light reached across the stone floor and found her. She was tall, broader at the shoulder than most men he'd known, with dark green skin glistening from the rain, and her short black hair plastered flat against her skull. Her clothing was torn leather and stitched hide, the kind that orcs of the northern clans wore for travel. A travel pack lay open near her feet. In her hands, wrapped carefully in a scrap of old leather, was a turnip from his root bin and a heel of stale rye bread. She froze. Her eyes, a pale, almost grey-green, found his face, and what he saw in them was not aggression, it was hunger. And beneath that, a fear she was working very hard to keep still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain outside struck the shutters. The fire in the stove threw out a low red pulse of light. Valen looked at the turnip in her hands, at the careful way she had wrapped it, like she was already thinking about someone else receiving it. Something in the back of his mind stirred, a strange feeling, almost like memory, as if he had stood in this exact moment before, as if the house itself had been waiting for it. He didn't understand it. He set the lantern down on the table and simply looked at her. "You walked a long way," he said at last. It was not a question. Her name was Sari. She did not offer it willingly. It came out only after she had stood rigid for 2 full minutes, clearly calculating whether the old man in front of her would call for soldiers or reach for a weapon. When neither happened, some of the stiffness left her shoulders. She spoke in the common tongue, with a heavy northern accent, the kind that turned the ends of words rough as stone. She said she had not meant to enter the house. The door to the root cellar had been unlocked, and she had assumed it led only to storage, not through to the kitchen. Valen looked at the door she'd come through. He had been meaning to fix the latch for 3 winters. He asked her where she was going. She said, "Nowhere, now." The clans of the Northern Highlands had been pushed south by a series of brutal seasons. 2 years of drought, followed by a third of floods that swallowed the root fields whole. The Highland orcs had scattered. Some had gone east toward Goldport, where humans paid bronze coins for strong backs on the docks. Some had gone north into the deep ranges to live or die by the old ways. Sari had come south because south was the only direction she had not yet tried. Valen set the lantern on the table and sat down in his chair. He gestured at the one across from him. She didn't sit. She stood with her back to the wall, the turnip still in her hands. He asked her why she'd come to the borderlands specifically. There was nothing here but river silt and pine trees, and a town full of humans who still carried old hatred toward her kind from the war. She looked at him steadily and said, "Because this far out, the soldiers don't patrol. They assume there's nothing worth protecting." He almost smiled. She watched him with the wariness of an animal that had been deceived by kindness before. He recognized the look. He had worn it himself. In the years after he came home from the war and found that the world had not arranged itself into something worth the cost he'd paid. Outside, the rain was letting up. The fire in the stove ticked quietly as it burned lower. The smell of wet pine came in under the door. Valen stood and walked to the stove. He lifted a pot that had been sitting on the warming rack, leftover bean stew, thick with dried herbs and a bit of cured pork. He set it over the heat and didn't say anything else until it began to steam. Then he got 2 bowls from the shelf. "Before we talk more," he said, setting both bowls on the table, "eat something." Sari looked at the bowl, then at him, then at the bowl again. She crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and sat down heavily in the chair across from him, setting the turnip carefully on the edge of the table. She ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had gone too long without. He did not watch her. He kept his eyes on his own bowl and let her have the dignity of not being observed. When she finished, she sat back and said quietly, "I have 2 children. They are hiding in your old stable. I told them to stay until I returned." The stove crackled. The last of the rain died outside. Valen set down his spoon. He looked at the wall, then at the lantern flame. "Then we should bring them in out of the cold," he said. The stable sat at the back of the property where the land dipped toward the Tescan. Valen had not kept animals for 2 years. The old mule had died the previous spring, and he had not replaced her. So the space was mostly hay bales and rusted equipment. It smelled of old straw and damp wood. Sari led the way with the lantern. Valen followed a few steps behind, his hands in his coat pockets, the mud sucking softly at his boots. She pulled open the stable door and spoke quietly in the northern dialect. A pause. Then 2 small figures emerged from behind a bale of hay near the back wall. The boy was older, perhaps 9 or 10 by the look of him, with the broad build that orc children carried even young. He had a short blade on his belt, a grown person's knife, far too large for him, and the expression of someone who has decided he is the protector of something. His name was Karok. The girl was younger, 5 or 6 winters, with large eyes the color of river water and a smear of dried mud on her forehead. She was holding a carved wooden bird with 1 wing broken, clutching it tight to her chest. Her name was Chanoa. Neither of them spoke. They looked at Valen, the way children look at things they have been warned about. He crouched down so he was at their level, which required some effort from his knees. He looked at the carved bird in Chanoa's arms and asked where it came from. Chanoa pulled it tighter and didn't answer. Karok put himself slightly in front of his sister and said, "She made it from a piece of driftwood from the Tescan." Valen looked at the bird more carefully. Even with a missing wing, the carving showed a careful hand. The body was shaped cleanly, the tail feathers distinct. The wing had a clean break, a replaceable piece, if someone had the right scrap of wood and a patient hour. He nodded and straightened up. He told them they could sleep inside, in the front room where the fire kept the walls warm. He told them they didn't have to talk or answer anything tonight. He told them there was leftover stew if they were hungry. Karok watched him with suspicious eyes all the way across the yard. Inside, Valen found extra blankets in the cedar chest and laid them out near the stove. Sari settled the children, speaking to them softly in her dialect. Chenoa fell asleep quickly, still holding the broken bird. Karok stayed awake a while longer, sitting up with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. The oversized knife on his belt. Valen sat in his chair near the window. The rain had stopped and the sky outside was clearing, stars emerging one by one through the broken clouds. He watched the Tescan glimmer in the far distance, its sound low and constant. He had a strange feeling that would not leave him, the same one from the kitchen, that sense of a moment already lived. He didn't know what to make of it. He let it sit. When he did sleep, he dreamed of the northern marches, but not the war. Just the land itself, high and cold and wide, before men had drawn their lines across it. Dawn came grey and pale over the Tescan valley. Valen was up before the others, feeding the stove and putting water on for grain porridge. He moved quietly, the way he had learned to move in a house where someone else was sleeping. Sari appeared in the doorway while the water was still heating. She had washed her face and retied her hair back with a strip of leather. In the daylight, Valen could see the full extent of what the road had cost her. The hollows beneath her cheekbones, the roughed skin on her hands, the careful way she held her left arm close to her side. That kind of stiffness, he knew from his own shoulder, meant an old injury pushed past its limit on the road. She looked at the stove and at the 2 bowls he had already set out. She said, "You don't have to do this." He said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want in return?" He stirred the porridge and thought about it honestly. He told her he needed help on the Tescan barge on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Cargo moved up and down the river for trade, and 1 set of arms wasn't enough anymore. He told her the turnip garden was behind for the season and needed 2 weeks of hard work to catch up. He told her the chicken coop roof had collapsed last autumn and he hadn't had the heart to fix it alone. He told her the work was real and the pay was meals, a warm place to sleep and a share of whatever the barge trade brought in. She listened without interrupting. He added carefully that he wasn't offering charity. He was short of help and she was short of a home, and that was a straightforward exchange between people who both needed something. Sari looked at him for a long moment. He had the impression she was searching his face for the trick in it, the hidden condition, the point at which the kindness would turn into a debt she couldn't pay back. "I have conditions," she said finally. He nodded. "Tell me." She said the children would not be separated from her. She said she would not work inside the town of Millbrook itself. She said if soldiers came, she needed a way out the back without being delayed. He agreed to all 3 without hesitation. She extended her hand, palm flat, in the northern Orc gesture of a binding pact, the same gesture used between clan elders when words became law. Valen pressed his palm to hers. From the front room, the sound of small feet on the floorboards. Chenoa appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, the broken bird still in her arms. She looked at the 2 of them, then at the pot on the stove, and said something quiet in her dialect. Sari answered her. Then she looked at Valen and said, "She wants to know if the bird smells like breakfast." Valen looked at the bird, then at the pot. "Tell her it does," he said. The first week was careful, polite, the kind of arrangement where everyone stays slightly to their side of an invisible line and pretends not to notice the other doing the same. Sari worked without complaint and without needing direction. She was faster on the barge than Valen expected. Her arms were strong, even after weeks of traveling lean, and she understood load balance by instinct, shifting cargo before he asked. On the Tescan, where the current ran fast near the rocky bends, that kind of instinct mattered. Her left arm gave her trouble on the heavier loads. He could see her jaw tighten when she lifted from that side, but she never mentioned it. and he didn't either. The children stayed close to the property. Carrock spent the first 3 days in the corner of the yard, closest to the tree line, the knife on his belt, watching the lane that led toward Millbrook. On the 4th day, he drifted toward the woodpile, and by the end of the week, he was splitting kindling without being asked. Genoa did not speak to Valen directly for the first 4 days. On the 5th day, she left the broken bird on the edge of his workbench and walked away without looking at him. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. The missing wing had a clean break, just as he'd noticed in the stable. He found a piece of pale birch in the scrap bin and spent an hour carving a replacement wing, matching the grain as close as he could. He left it beside the bird on the bench before turning in. The next morning, both pieces were gone. He didn't ask about them. On the second Tuesday barge run, they were unloading split timber when Sari stopped and stood very still near the river's edge, head tilted. He asked her what was wrong. She said, "The soil on the east bank, it's different." He told her it was lower ground, gets saturated in spring. She shook her head and walked to the bank, crouching to press her fingers into the mud. She dug down 6 inches and turned the soil in her palm, smelling it. She said she knew a root crop that grew in exactly this kind of earth, an Orc variety from the northern highlands, dense and slow and almost impossible to kill by drought or flood. She had seeds. She had carried them sewn into the lining of her travel pack, she said, because they were the last things her mother had given her before the clan scattered. Valen looked at the river mud in her palm. He thought about his turnip beds, which had been failing for 2 seasons. He told her to plant whatever she thought would grow. That evening, sitting on the porch with the Tescan loud in the distance and the stars very bright above the pine ridge, Sari said, "Your house doesn't feel like a man who wanted to be alone." He thought about that for a long time before he answered. "It felt that way for a while," he said. "I think I got it mixed up with quiet." The seeds Sari planted on the east bank took hold fast. Within 2 weeks, pale green shoots had pushed through the river mud in neat rows, dense and determined. Within a month, the stalks were knee-high and thick as a man's thumb, a deep northern variety that held its water inside the root. Nothing like the soft, pale turnips that Millbrook's market sold. These were hard and dark-skinned, the kind of crop that kept through deep winter without losing sweetness. Word travelled the way it always did in border country, slowly, on the tongues of barge traders. By the 4th week, 2 farmers from the upstream settlements had stopped at Valen's landing, wanting to know what grew on his east bank. One was old Permot, whose family had farmed the ridge for 40 years. The other was a younger man from the way station, run by a widow named Sella, who had sent him down to see what the river traders were talking about. Sari showed them both. She showed them the depth of planting, the spacing, the way to read the soil color for moisture. She did not charge them, and she did not make a speech. She simply knelt in the mud and showed them with her hands. Valen watched from the porch and said nothing. Carrock had stopped monitoring the lane by this point. He had taken to following Valen at a distance during the morning chores, watching the fence repairs, the barge rigging, the way the pulleys worked on the loading crane. He didn't ask questions. He watched. On a morning in the 3rd week, Valen handed him a hammer without comment and pointed at a fence post that needed resetting, and Carrock drove it into the ground with 3 efficient strikes. Genoa painted. She had found a way to grind certain local berries and river clay into a workable pigment, and she covered the flat white stones along the cottage path with shapes, birds, rivers, hands, trees. Valen did not ask her to stop. He walked around the stones carefully. Through those weeks, he sometimes caught a glimpse of Genoa at his workbench in the evenings, hunched over something small, her tongue pressed to her lip in concentration. He never looked directly. He gave her the bench and the lamplight and went to sit by the window. The feeling he had carried since the first night, that strange sense of recognition, of something already known, had quieted somewhat. Not gone, but settled, the way a river settles after the snow melt slows. He thought sometimes that maybe it hadn't been a premonition of something strange at all. Maybe it had simply been the house telling him, in whatever way houses do, that it was tired of being empty. He did not say any of this aloud. He fixed the coop roof with Karok's help, restocked the root bins, and settled the accounts from the barge trade. When he tallied it at the end of the month, the numbers were better than they had been in 3 years. He folded the paper and put it in the chest where he kept the important things. That evening, Sari cooked a northern stew, dark broth, bones, river herbs, and they ate at the table, all 4 of them. Chenoa told a story in her dialect about a bird that flew too close to the sun and came home with its feathers on fire, and Sari translated it in pieces between spoonfuls. Valen laughed once, a short, startled sound that surprised him. The 3 riders came on a Thursday afternoon when the mist sat low on the valley. Valen heard them before he saw them. Hooves on the muddy lane. A heavy, unhurried pace that said these were men who expected to arrive somewhere and be received. He set down his tools and walked to the front of the house. The 2 men flanking the leader were hired blades, recognizable by their mismatched armor and the way they scanned the property without making eye contact. The man in the center was an orc himself, which was the part that didn't fit the usual picture. He was broad and well-fed, wearing human militia colors over orc leathers, the kind of combination that meant he had sold his allegiance somewhere south. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and looked around with the unhurried expression of a man assessing what something was worth. His name, Valen would learn, was Hector. He worked for a landholder outside Millbrook named Dunn, who had been slowly acquiring border properties for 4 years by finding reasons to make them uninhabitable. Hector said he was collecting a territory assessment, a fee owed to the eastern holdings for protection of the borderland lanes. Valen said he didn't recognize any such fee. Hector smiled not unkindly and said that wasn't really how it worked. He said he could smell that Valen had orc squatters on the property. He said that was a violation of the Millbrook Garrison Charter, which gave Dunn's men authority to remove unauthorized residents. He made it sound like a formality. From inside the house, Sari appeared in the doorway. She had heard the voices. Behind her, just visible in the shadow of the hall, was Karok with his oversized knife gripped in both hands. Hector looked at Sari with the flat, practiced contempt of someone who had decided long ago that certain kinds of people were beneath consideration, even when those people shared his blood. He said, "Bring them out. We'll settle the fee in labor. 2 adults and working-sized children is a fair offset." Valen felt the anger come up clean and cold in his chest. He did not raise his voice. He did not move toward the men. He stood where he was, in the mud of his own yard, and said in a voice that did not shake, "This land runs from the eastern pine break to the 3rd bend of the Tescan. It belongs to no charter in Millbrook. These people work it with me. You're welcome to leave by the same lane you came in on." One of the hired blades shifted in his saddle. Hector looked at Valen for a long moment. Then he said, "We'll return when you've had time to reconsider." He turned his horse without hurry and rode back up the lane. That night, Valen sat on the porch for a long time without going in. The Tescan ran loud below. Sari came out eventually and sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while. "He'll come back," she said. "I know," he said. They prepared. Sari sent word upriver through the barge network. 2 trade contacts she had made from the East Bank landings who owed her nothing but had seen her work and respected it. Within 3 days, she had a rough picture of Hector's pattern. He moved on Fridays. He brought 5 men when he expected resistance. He answered to a captain named Vaga in Millbrook, who was known to avoid anything that might bring outside attention to the borderlands. That was the pressure point. Valen spent 2 days writing. He wrote to the Tescan River Trade Council, a body in the capital that had jurisdiction over commercial waterway access. He wrote that a private militia in the borderlands was attempting to extort barge operators and seize working farmland under false charter claims. He wrote it plainly, without embellishment. He sent copies via 3 separate barge captains heading east. He also rode out to speak to Permot and Seller directly, the two he had met through the East Bank plantings. He told them what was coming. He did not ask them for anything. Permot said he'd be on the lane on Friday morning with his draft horse and wagon, running a delivery that happened to require passing Valen's gate at regular intervals. Seller said she'd have customers at the way station who'd need to use the lane for resupply. It was not an army, but it was witnesses. On Friday morning, Valen stood at the gate. The fog was still on the valley. Behind him, inside, Sari had the children in the back room with their packs assembled, the rear window unlatched, the exit she had asked for and he had promised. Karok had left his knife on the table because Valen had asked him to, quietly and once. The boy had pushed it across the wood, without looking up, and gone to sit with his sister. Hector arrived with 5 men this time, as expected. Captain Vaga rode with them, which meant someone had decided to formalize the threat. Vaga was a heavy man in full garrison armor, and he had the face of someone who was very good at the administrative side of cruelty. He unrolled a paper that he said was an eviction order under Millbrook Charter. Valen said, "I filed with the River Trade Council 3 days ago. You're operating outside sanctioned territory. Any eviction you carry out here is a crime under the waterway statutes, not a charter matter." Vaga's expression did not change, but he looked at the lane where Permot's wagon was making its slow pass, and at the Tescan below, where 2 barge captains had anchored mid-morning for no obvious commercial reason. He folded the paper. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Valen agreed. "But today it is." They left. Hector didn't look back. Vaga did, once, measuring, and then he was gone up the lane with his men, the sound of hooves fading into the pines. The fog began to lift. Inside, Sari had not moved from the back room. When Valen appeared in the doorway, she let out a long, controlled breath. Chenoa climbed down from the window ledge she'd been sitting on and came to press her face against her mother's arm. Karok crossed to the table, picked up his knife, and put it back on his belt. The danger was past, and with it, the reason to leave it down. Valen sat in his chair. His hands were shaking slightly, which he had not permitted them to do outside. He pressed them flat against his knees until they stopped. The winter settled in slowly that year, the cold arriving in stages rather than the sudden hard freeze that usually came off the northern mountains. Valen took it as a good sign, though he had long since stopped trusting signs. The letter from the River Trade Council arrived 6 weeks after Vaga's departure. It was brief and official and stated that the Eastern Holdings charter claims on borderland territory were under formal investigation. It did not promise resolution, but it put Dunn's operation on record, which made expansion difficult. Vaga did not return. Hector was seen once more in the spring, passing through on the road to Goldport. He did not stop. The East Bank crops came through the winter well. The dark-skinned roots held under the frost, and in the early thaw, Sari brought up a harvest that filled the storage shed to the rafters. Permot and Seller's man had planted the same variety on her instruction. Both did well. Chenoa's stones lined the full length of the cottage path now. New ones appeared regularly. She had expanded her pigment range with a muddy ochre she found near the second Tescan bend and a pale ash-grey from the pine bark. Valen had stopped walking around the stones. He had started stepping over them carefully instead. The way you step over something you want to keep. On a morning in early spring, when the Tescan was running high with snowmelt and the first birds had returned to the pine ridge, Chenoa came to Valen's workbench. She set the carved bird down in front of him, both wings intact, the replacement piece fitted and sanded smooth by her own hand, just as he had seen her working on it through those quiet evenings. She said something in her dialect. Valen looked at Sari. Sari said, "She says the bird is done now." She says you can have it because you gave it its wing back." He picked the bird up. He turned it in his hands. The two wings were not perfectly matched. The replacement was slightly lighter wood, a different grain, but they balanced. The bird sat level. He set it on the shelf above the workbench, where he kept the things he intended to keep. That evening they ate on the porch for the first time since autumn, wrapped in coats, the river loud below, and the sky going orange over the western ridge. Carrock had shot a brace of wood ducks on the Tescan, his first, and they roasted over the outdoor pit. The smell of wood smoke and rendered fat moved through the cold air. Valen looked at the three of them across the fire. Chenoa was telling Carrock something, pointing at a star with one finger. Sari was watching the river with the expression she wore when she was at rest. Not quite peaceful, but something close. He thought about the morning he had walked to the kitchen with a lantern and no weapon. The strange feeling from that first night finally made sense to him now, in the simple way things sometimes do when enough time has passed. It had not been a premonition of danger. It had been recognition, the house knowing before he did that something missing was about to arrive. He'd been carrying old weight for a long time. He still was, but it was not alone in there anymore. Mixed in now with other things, the weight of the harvest, of the repaired coop, of a child's carved bird on a shelf, of 4 people eating by a fire at the edge of a river that did not care about charters or borders. He did not say any of this. He got up to turn the ducks on the spit. The Tescan ran on below, loud and cold, and indifferent and constant, the way it always had. The stars came out one by one over the pine ridge. The fire burned low and warm. It was enough. It was more than enough.